Please respect Bookshare membership and copyright obligations in the use of this audio file. Chapter 4. Good Intentions, Bad Science, The Closed Loop of Clinical Judgment. Block quote. It doesn't matter how beautiful the guess is, or how smart the guesser is, or how famous the guesser is, if the experiment disagrees with the guess, then the guess is wrong. That's all there is to it. Block quote end. Block quote. Physicist Richard Feynman, block quote end. If Holly Ramona felt dissonance at the verdict that convicted her therapists of implanting false memories in her, how do you imagine her therapists felt? Would they be inclined to say, "Oh dear, Holly, we apologize for being so dreadfully mistaken in our treatment of your depression and eating disorders. We had better go back to school and learn a little more about memory"? The response of another psychotherapist is, we fear, more typical. A woman we will call Grace went into therapy after having a panic attack. She was not getting along with her male employer, and for the first time in her life she felt she was in a situation she could not control. But instead of treating her for panic attacks or helping her solve the job difficulty, the psychotherapist decided that Grace's symptoms meant that her father had sexually abused her when she was a child. At first, Grace embraced her therapist's interpretation. After all, the therapist was an expert on these matters. Over time, she, like Holly, came to believe that her father had molested her. Grace accused her father directly, cut off relations with her parents and sisters, and temporarily left her husband and son. Yet her new memories never felt right to her, because they contradicted the overall history of her good and loving relationship with her father. One day she told the therapist that she no longer believed her father had ever abused her. Grace's therapist might have accepted what her client told her and begun working with her on finding a better explanation for her problems. She might have read up on the latest research showing which therapeutic approach is the method of choice for panic attacks. She might have talked over the case with her colleagues, to see if she was overlooking something. Grace's therapist, however, did none of these things. When Grace expressed doubts that her recovered memories were true, the therapist replied, "You're sicker than you ever were." Superscript 1. Superscript end. In the 1980s and 1990s, the newly emerging evidence of the sexual abuse of children and women set off two unintended hysterical epidemics. One was the phenomenon of recovered memory therapy, in which adults went into therapy with no memory of childhood trauma and came out believing that they had been sexually molested by their parents or tortured in satanic cults, sometimes for many years, without ever being aware of it at the time and without any corroboration by siblings, friends, or physicians. Under hypnosis, they said, their therapists enabled them to remember the horrifying experiences they had suffered as toddlers, as infants in the crib, and sometimes even in previous lives. One woman recalled that her mother put spiders in her vagina. Another said her father had molested her from the ages of 5 to 23, and even raped her just days before her wedding, memories she repressed until therapy. Others said they had been burned, although their bodies bore no scars. Some said they had been impregnated and forced to have abortions, although their bodies showed no evidence. Those who went to court to sue their alleged perpetrators were able to call on expert witnesses, many with impressive credentials in clinical psychology and psychiatry, who testified that these recovered memories were valid evidence of abuse. Superscript 2. Superscript end. The second major epidemic was a panic about the sexual abuse of children in daycare centers. In 1983, teachers at the McMartin Preschool in Manhattan Beach, California, were accused of committing heinous acts on the toddlers in their care, such as torturing them in satanic rituals in underground chambers, slaughtering pet rabbits in front of them, and forcing them to submit to sexual acts. Some children said the teachers had taken them flying in an airplane. The prosecution was unable to convince the jury that the children had been abused, but the case produced copycat accusations against daycare teachers across the country. The Little Rascals daycare case in North Carolina, Kelly Michaels in New Jersey, the Amirault family in Massachusetts, Dale Akiki in San Diego, and alleged molestation rings in Jordan, Minnesota, Wenatchee, Washington, Niles, Michigan, Miami, Florida, and dozens of other communities. Everywhere, the children told bizarre stories. Some said they had been attacked by a robot, molested by clowns and lobsters, or forced to eat a frog. One boy said he had been tied naked to a tree in the schoolyard in front of all the teachers and children, although no passerby noticed it and no other child verified it. Social workers and other psychotherapists were called in to assess the children's stories, do therapy with the children, and help them disclose what had happened. Many later testified in court that, on the basis of their clinical judgment, they were certain the daycare teachers were guilty. Superscript 3 Superscript End. Where do epidemics go when they die? How come celebrities have not been turning up on talk shows lately to reveal their recovered memories of having been tortured as infants? Have all the sadistic pedophiles closed down their daycare centers? Most of the teachers who were convicted in the daycare cases have been freed on appeal, but many teachers and parents remain in prison, or are confined to house arrest, or must live out their lives as registered sex offenders. The heyday of the recovered memory movement is past, although many lives were shattered and countless families have never been reunited. But cases still occasionally appear in the courts, in the news, in films, and in popular books. Superscript 4 Superscript End. Martha Beck's Leaving the Saints, which describes how her Mormon father had allegedly subjected her to ritual sexual abuse when she was a child, neglects to tell readers that she had forgotten all about it until she consulted a recovered memory psychotherapist who taught her self-hypnosis. Thus, while the epidemics have subsided, the assumptions that ignited them remain embedded in popular culture. If you were repeatedly traumatized in childhood, you probably repressed the memory of it. If you repressed the memory of it, hypnosis can retrieve it for you. If you are utterly convinced that your memories are true, they are. If you have no memories but merely suspect that you were abused, you probably were. If you have sudden flashbacks or dreams of abuse, you are uncovering a true memory. Children almost never lie about sexual matters. If your child has nightmares, wets the bed, wants to sleep with a nightlight, or masturbates, those might be signs your child has been molested. These beliefs did not pop up in the cultural landscape overnight, like mushrooms. They came from mental health professionals who disseminated them at conferences, in clinical journals, in the media, and in best-selling books, and who promoted themselves as experts in diagnosing child sexual abuse and determining the validity of a recovered memory. Their claims were based largely on lingering Freudian, and pseudo-Freudian, ideas about repression, memory, sexual trauma, and the meaning of dreams, and on their own confidence in their clinical powers of insight and diagnosis. All the claims these therapists made have since been scientifically studied. All of them are mistaken. It is painful to admit this, but when the McMartin story first hit the news, the two of us, independently, were inclined to believe that the preschool teachers were guilty. Not knowing the details of the allegations, we mindlessly accepted the "where there's smoke, there's fire" cliché. As scientists, we should have known better. When, months after the trial ended, the full story came out about the emotionally disturbed mother who made the first accusation and whose charges became crazier and crazier until even the prosecutors stopped paying attention to her, about how the children had been coerced over many months to tell by zealous social workers on a moral crusade, about how the children's stories became increasingly outlandish, we felt foolish and embarrassed that we had sacrificed our scientific skepticism on the altar of outrage. Our initial gullibility caused us plenty of dissonance, and it still does. But our dissonance is nothing compared to that of the people who were personally involved or who took a public stand, including the many psychotherapists, psychiatrists, and social workers who considered themselves skilled clinicians and advocates for children's rights. None of us likes learning that we were wrong, that our memories are distorted or confabulated, or that we made an embarrassing professional mistake. For people in any of the healing professions, the stakes are especially high. If you hold a set of beliefs that guide your practice and you learn that some of them are mistaken, you must either admit you were wrong and change your approach, or reject the new evidence. If the mistakes are not too threatening to your view of your competence and if you have not taken a public stand defending them, you will probably willingly change your approach, grateful to have a better one. But if some of those mistaken beliefs have made your client's problems worse, torn up your client's family, or sent innocent people to prison, then you, like Grace's therapist, will have serious dissonance to resolve. It's the Semmelweis dilemma that we described in the introduction. Why didn't his colleagues tell him, say, Ignac, thank you so much for finding the reason for the tragic, unnecessary deaths of our patients? For these physicians to have accepted his simple, life-saving intervention, wash your hands, they would have had to admit that they had been the cause of the deaths of all those women in their care. This was an intolerable realization, for it went straight to the heart of the physicians' view of themselves as medical experts and wise healers, and so, in essence, they told Semmelweis to get lost and take his stupid ideas with him. Because their stubborn refusal to accept Semmelweis's evidence, the lower death rate among his own patients happened long before the era of malpractice suits. We can say with assurance that they were acting out of a need to protect their egos, not their income. Medicine has advanced since their day, but the need for self-justification hasn't budged. Most occupations are ultimately, if slowly, self-improving and self-correcting. If you are a physician today, you wash your hands and you wear latex gloves, and if you forget, your colleagues, nurses, or patients will remind you. If you run a toy company and make a mistake in predicting that your new doll will outsell Barbie, the market will let you know. If you are a scientist, you can't fake the data on your cloned sheep and then try to pull the wool over your colleagues' eyes. The first lab that cannot replicate your results will race to tell the world. If you are an experimental psychologist and make a mistake in the design of your experiment or analysis of results, your colleagues and critics will be eager to inform you, the rest of the scientific community, and everyone on the ex-planet Pluto. Naturally, not all scientists are scientific, that is, open-minded and willing to give up their strong convictions or admit that conflicts of interest might taint their research. But even when an individual scientist is not self-correcting, science eventually is. The mental health professions are different. People who work in these fields have an amalgam of credentials, training, and approaches that often bear little connection to one another. Imagine that the profession of law consisted of people who attended law school, studied every topic within the law, and passed the grueling bar exam, and of people who only paid $78 and took a weekend course in courtroom etiquette. You will have a glimpse of the problem. In the profession of psychotherapy, clinical psychologists are the closest equivalents of trained lawyers. Most have a PhD, and if they earn their degree from a major university rather than from an independent therapy mill, they have a knowledge of basic psychological findings. Some do research themselves, for example on the ingredients of successful therapy or on the origins of emotional disorders. But whether or not they personally do research, they tend to be well versed in psychological science and in knowing which kind of therapy is demonstrably most effective for what problem. For example, cognitive and behavioral methods are the psychological treatments of choice for panic attacks, depression, eating disorders, insomnia, chronic anger, and other emotional disorders. These methods are often as effective or more effective than medication. Superscript 5 Superscript End. In contrast, most psychiatrists, who have medical degrees, learn about medicine and medication, but they rarely learn much about the scientific method or even about basic research in psychology. Throughout the 20th century, they were generally practitioners of Freudian psychoanalysis or one of its offshoots. You needed an MD to be admitted to a psychoanalytic training institute. As the popularity of psychoanalysis declined and the biomedical model of disorder gained the upper hand, Most psychiatrists began treating patients with medication rather than any form of talk therapy. Yet while psychiatrists learn about the brain, many still learn almost nothing about psychology or about the questioning, skeptical essence of science. Anthropologist Tanya Luhrmann spent 4 years studying residents in psychiatry, attending their classes and conventions, observing them in clinics and emergency rooms. She found that residents are not expected to read much, rather, they are expected to absorb the lessons handed them without debate or question. The lectures they attend offer practical skills, not intellectual substance. A lecturer will talk about what to do in therapy rather than why the therapy helps or what kind of therapy might be best for a given problem. Superscript 6 Superscript End. Finally, there are the many people who practice one of the many different forms of psychotherapy. Some have a master's degree in psychology, counseling, or clinical social work. They are licensed in their specialty, such as marriage and family therapy. Some, however, have no training in psychology at all, or even a college degree. The word psychotherapist is unregulated. In many states, anyone can say that he or she is a therapist without having any training in anything. In the past 2 decades, as the number of mental health practitioners of all kinds has soared, most psychotherapy training programs have cut themselves off from their scientifically trained cousins in university departments of psychology. Superscript 7 Superscript End. What do we need to know statistics and research for? Many graduates of these programs ask. All we need to know is how to do therapy, and for that, I mostly need clinical experience. In some respects, they are right. Therapists are constantly making decisions about the course of treatment. What might be beneficial now? What direction should we go? Is this the right time to risk challenging my client's story, or will I challenge him right out of the room? Making these decisions requires experience with the infinite assortment of quirks and passions of the human psyche, that heart of darkness and love. Moreover, by its very nature, psychotherapy is a private transaction between the therapist and the client. No one is looking over the therapist's shoulder in the intimacy of the consulting room, eager to pounce if he or she does something wrong. Yet the inherent privacy of the transaction means that therapists who lack training in science and skepticism have no internal corrections to the self-protecting cognitive biases that afflict us all. What these therapists see confirms what they believe, and what they believe shapes what they see. It's a closed loop. Did my client improve? Excellent, what I did was effective. Did my client remain unchanged or get worse? That's unfortunate, but she is resistant to therapy and deeply troubled. Besides, sometimes the client has to get worse before she can get better. Do I believe that repressed rage causes sexual difficulties? My client's erection problem must reflect his repressed rage at his mother or his wife. Do I believe that sexual abuse causes eating disorders? My client's bulimia must mean she was molested as a child. We want to be clear that most therapists are effective, and that some clients are resistant to therapy and are deeply troubled. This chapter is not an indictment of therapy, any more than writing about the mistakes of memory means that all memory is unreliable, or that writing about the conflicts of interest among scientists means that all scientists do tainted research. Our intention is to examine the kinds of mistakes that can result from the closed loop of clinical practice, and show how self-justification perpetuates them. For anyone in private practice, skepticism and science are ways out of the closed loop. Skepticism, for example, teaches therapists to be cautious about taking what their clients tell them at face value. If a woman says her mother put spiders in her vagina when she was 3, the skeptical therapist can be empathic without believing that this event literally happened. If a child says his teachers took him flying in a plane full of clowns and frogs, the skeptical therapist might be charmed by the story without believing that teachers actually chartered a private jet, on their salary, no less. Scientific research provides therapists with ways of improving their clinical practice and of avoiding mistakes. If you are going to use hypnosis, For example, you had better know that while hypnosis can help clients learn to relax, manage pain, and quit smoking, you should never use it to help your client retrieve memories, because your willing, vulnerable client will often make up a memory that is unreliable. Superscript 8 Superscript End. Yet today there are many thousands of psychiatrists, social workers, counselors, and psychotherapists who go into private practice with neither skepticism nor evidence to guide them. Paul Meehl, who achieved great distinction as both a clinician and a scientific researcher, once observed that when he was a student, the common factor in the training of all psychologists was the general scientific commitment not to be fooled and not to fool anyone else. Some things have happened in the world of clinical practice that worry me in this respect. That skepsis, that passion not to be fooled and not to fool anyone else, does not seem to be as fundamental a part of all psychologists' mental equipment as it was a half-century ago. I have heard of some psychological testimony in courtrooms locally in which this critical mentality appears to be largely absent. Superscript 9 Superscript End. An example of the problem Meehl feared can be seen in the deposition of a prominent psychiatrist, Bessel van der Kolk, who has testified frequently on behalf of plaintiffs in repressed memory cases. Van der Kolk explained that as a psychiatrist, he had had medical training and a psychiatric residency, but had never taken a course in experimental psychology. Block quote. Q. Are you aware of any research on the reliability or the validity of clinical judgment or clinical predictions based on interview information? Block quote end. Block quote. A. Number, block quote end. Block quote. Q. What's your understanding of the current term disconfirming evidence? Block quote end. Block quote. A. I guess that means evidence that disconfirms treasured notions that people have. Block quote end. Block quote. Q. What's the most powerful piece of disconfirming evidence that you're aware of for the theory that people can repress memories or that they can block out of their awareness a series of traumatic events, store those in their memory, and recover those with some accuracy years later? Block quote end. Block quote. A. What's the strongest thing against that? Block quote end. Block quote. Q. Yes. What's the strongest piece of disconfirming evidence? Block quote end. Block quote. A. I really can't think of any good evidence against that. Block quote end. Block quote. Q. Have you read any literature on the concept of false memories using hypnosis? Block quote end. Block quote. A. Number, block quote end. Block quote. Q. Is there research on whether clinicians over a period of years develop more accurate clinical judgment? Block quote end. Block quote. A. I don't know if there is, actually. Block quote end. Block quote. Q. Is there a technique that you use to distinguish true and false memories? Block quote end. Block quote. A. We all as human beings are continuously faced with whether we believe what somebody feeds us or not, and we all make judgments all the time. And there is such a thing as internal consistency, and if people tell you something with internal consistency and with appropriate effect, you tend to believe that the stories are true. Superscript 10 Superscript End. Block quote end. At the time of this deposition, Van der Kolk had not read any of the voluminous research literature on false memories or how hypnosis can create them, nor was he aware of the documented unreliability of clinical predictions based on interview information. He had not read any of the research disconfirming his belief that traumatic memories are commonly repressed. Yet he has testified frequently and confidently on behalf of plaintiffs in repressed memory cases. Like many clinicians, he is confident that he knows when a client is telling the truth, and whether a memory is true or false, based on his clinical experience. The clues are whether the client's story has internal consistency and whether the client recounts the memory with appropriate emotion, that is, whether the client really feels the memory is true. The problem with this reasoning, however, is that, as we saw in the previous chapter, thousands of mentally healthy people believe they were abducted by aliens, telling, with all the appropriate feeling, internally consistent stories of the bizarre experiments they believe they endured. As research psychologist John Killstrom has observed, the weakness of the relationship between accuracy and confidence is one of the best documented phenomena in the 100-year history of eyewitness memory research. Superscript 11 Superscript End. But Van der Kolk was unaware of a finding that just about every undergraduate who has taken Psychology 101 would know. No one is suggesting that UN observers disturb the privacy of the therapeutic encounter, or that all therapists should start doing their own research. An understanding of how to think scientifically may not aid therapists in the subjective process of helping a client who is searching for answers to existential questions. But it matters profoundly when therapists claim expertise and certainty in domains in which unverified clinical opinion can ruin lives. The scientific method consists of the use of procedures designed to show not that our predictions and hypotheses are right, but that they might be wrong. Scientific reasoning is useful to anyone in any job because it makes us face the possibility, even the dire reality, that we were mistaken. It forces us to confront our self-justifications and put them on public display for others to puncture. At its core, therefore, science is a form of arrogance control.